So we're beginning today just a series of talks about Christmas, and the first of these is about Joseph. So there we are, Joseph, the carpenter. Okay. Now, as a young person, this has got nothing to do with Joseph, by the way. As a young person, I was a great fan of John Wayne. And one of the films that he made, which was not your normal Western or war film that John Wayne was in, not one of those stereotypes, it was called The Quiet Man. And it was all about an American who returned to his ancestral home in Ireland. There he confronted the local bad guy and got rid of him, dealt with him, and his bumpy journey to winning the heart of a beautiful Irish girl. Now maybe it all sounds a bit twee to you. I loved it, I still love it. So who cares? But it's the title of that film that's always intrigued me. The Quiet Man. And I think it would be an apt title to give to Joseph. Joseph, the husband of Mary. Now Joseph, as you will know from all those school nativity plays, is one of the central figures in the Christmas story. And yet, in the biblical account, we don't hear a single word come from his mouth. In those school nativity plays, he might knock on the door of an inn and say, "Any room, please, take us in." But in the biblical account, he didn't say a single word. He was the archetypal quiet man. But if we start to dig a little bit deeper, I believe there's much more that we can learn from him. This quiet man. More than just him being a bystander, looking over the central figures of Mary and the infant Jesus. So I want to dig a little bit further into this man, Joseph. And what can we learn from him? Well, the first thing is he was chosen. He was chosen. He was chosen to be the earthly father of God's Son. Now that is some task, isn't it? For someone who seemingly has nothing to say for himself, he was chosen to be the earthly father of God's Son. Why? What were his qualifications for that? Well, firstly, he was a descendant of King David. And the Messiah was to come from David's line. All the prophecies said that. So he was qualified because he was descended from David. Secondly, he was betrothed to Mary. And Mary was the person God chose to be the mother of his Son. Thirdly, he was from a humble background. Yes, he might have been descended from David, but really he was from a humble background. He was a carpenter by trade, carpenter from Nazareth. But we have to get over the idea that a carpenter was just simply somebody who worked with wood, because actually a carpenter in those days could be somebody who worked with a lot of other things as well. He could have worked with metal and stone as well. And one of the things that we know is that near to this place, Nazareth, where Joseph and Mary settled, was the capital of the area that was known as Galilee. And that capital was a brand new city being built, and there was lots of work for skilled men like Joseph, and probably he would have worked there at Sepphoris, that capital, in the building trade. So he was humble, but he was a skilled man. And why does that matter? He fitted the bill that God wanted for the Son of God to be born into a humble family and not into some royal splendour. And fourth, he was someone who could be trusted, as we'll see in a few moments. So he was chosen. And the question for us, are you chosen by God? And the answer is yes. Each one of you sat here this morning has been chosen by God. So as we think about why Joseph was chosen, think about why God may have chosen you. What is it that you are good at? What is it about your background? What about where you live? What are the qualifications that could make you especially chosen for a particular task or tasks? Who are you? What qualities do you have that God could use? And what task or tasks does God have for you? If you don't want to do anything else today, think about that. In the light of Joseph being chosen by God, you too are chosen. Second thing about Joseph, he was righteous and honourable. It mattered to Joseph that he did the right thing. It must have been a shock to him when he heard from Mary that the girl he was betrothed to was pregnant. Mary and he had probably been engaged when she was a young child. That was the system. And now as a teenager, she and Joseph would have reached that stage in their relationship that was known as betrothal. This meant that there was a formal ratification of the marriage to be. They weren't yet actually married, but it was as good as. And the marriage would come probably a year after the betrothal. So they were in this betrothed state. And to not be married to one another, then they would have had, even during this betrothed state, to get a divorce. So despite what must have been a sense of betrayal, Joseph had settled on quietly divorcing Mary rather than exposing her to the public humiliation because she'd become pregnant by somebody other than the person she was betrothed to. Or exposing her even to the full force of the Mosaic law, which said that a woman who'd committed adultery, which is what the only conclusion that Joseph and others could have reached, the penalty was that she should be stoned to death. Now, of course, when Joseph heard Mary explaining the origins of this pregnancy, it's God. He could only conclude that she was making it up, and she had in fact betrayed him. But despite all of that, he wasn't prepared to make a spectacle of her. How do we react in stressful conditions? Is our first thought to do the right thing, or is it to have our own way? Let me encourage you. Follow Joseph's example of seeking the right way, seeking to do the right thing, seeking to be honourable, seeking to be a person of integrity. He was chosen. He was righteous and honourable. Third, he listened to God. Joseph really does listen to God. If we read his story, that stands out above all other things. And God chooses to speak to Joseph in a very particular way. God speaks to Joseph through dreams. 4 times Matthew records Joseph hearing from God. First of all, an angel in his dream tells him to go ahead and marry Mary. She is telling the truth. Do it. Go ahead and marry Mary. Then an angel warns him in a dream to escape with Mary and Jesus and flee to Egypt. Be asylum seekers there. Get out from danger. Then an angel tells him in a dream that it was safe to go back to the land of Israel. And finally in a dream, he was warned to avoid going to Judea, where Herod's son was now king, and to go to Galilee instead, to go to Nazareth. And never once in these cases does Joseph question that he's hearing from God. Never once. This story speaks of a life tuned into God. God spoke to him through dreams. Now, God may not speak to you and me through dreams, or maybe he does. Maybe he does speak through dreams to you. So how does he speak? Because my conviction is that God speaks. Perhaps it's through the Bible, or through other things that you might read of a Christian persuasion. Maybe it's through what others have to say, even a sermon. You know, God can speak through a sermon. Or through a conversation. Maybe through your thought life, your intellectual life. Maybe it's through signs and symbols. Maybe you tuned in to God that way. Or through pictures that God plants in your mind. All these are the way God speaks. The question isn't whether God speaks to us, because he does. The real question is, are you listening? Are you willing to hear? What are you doing to get tuned in? Now here's a challenge for you. We've got Advent coming up. It starts next Sunday and it goes through until Christmas Day. During this time of Advent, if you've never done it before, take some time each day and ask God to speak. Just invite him to speak. And then wait and see what comes. And what does come, be willing to share it with others. So, next, Joseph. He was caring and protecting. Joseph may have been a man of few words, but his love and care for Mary was clear. That's why he was not prepared to throw her to the wolves when he found out that she was pregnant. He discovered that he was entrusted with this most precious, tiny baby who was God making himself vulnerable. And precisely because he was a man who was caring and compassionate and protective of those he loved, he took care of this little baby. And that's why he was desperate to find somewhere for the heavily pregnant Mary to rest when they were forced to make the journey to Bethlehem. That's why he hurriedly took care when he knew that Jesus' life was threatened. That's why we hear a lot about Joseph doing things. He did things to care. We hear a lot about toxic masculinity today. Joseph, I believe, shows us masculinity at its best. He worked with his hands. In a sense, he was a man's man. But he shows us also how to care, how to put others first rather than his own reputation and his own comfort and his own safety. So my question to you is Joseph or Andrew Tate? Joseph or Andrew Tate? And if you don't know who Andrew Tate is, where have you been for the last few years? Which of these will be a better role model for us fellas, for boys, for males today? Lastly, he was obedient to God. When the angel told him to marry Mary rather than divorce her, he did. When the angel told him to name the child Jesus, he did. When the angel told him to flee from Bethlehem, he did. When the angel told him that they could go back to Israel, he did. Unquestioning, that's the way he was. God said, and Joseph did. What an example. How faithful are we in following God? Would we make Joseph, who did what God asked of him, our model? Or would we make Jonah, who ran away when God asked him to do something, our model? Which are we more like, Joseph or Jonah? Let's learn to be obedient in the way Joseph was. A church made up of people like that would be a real powerhouse for building the kingdom of God in this place. Let us be those kind of people, obedient people. Obedient. And let this church be an obedient kind of church. Obedient to God. Let me finish with two quotes about Joseph. The first is this. St. Joseph, you can tell it comes from a Catholic stable. St. Joseph was an ordinary sort of man on whom God relied to do great things. He did exactly what the Lord wanted him to do in each and every event that went to make up his life. What an obituary that would be for anyone. And then finally, from the previous poet, Benedict, let us allow ourselves to be infected by St. Joseph's silence. There's the quiet man. Infected by St. Joseph's silence. We need it greatly in a world that is often too noisy, that does not favour meditation or listening to the voice of God. Joseph. There's a great deal more to him than him just being the quiet man.